Good afternoon and thank you for tuning into this video. This will be the first in a series of videos that explain the tribulation as is presented throughout the entire scriptures. And the title of this is The Sequence of Events for the Tribulation. Now this video and the next video are going to be the introduction and background. Today's video will be approximately 35 minutes, and there will be a second video which takes it up to a total of an hour and 15 minutes. My name is Jeff Childs, and I have a bachelor's degree in pastoral theology from Southeastern Bible College in Birmingham, Alabama. In February 2013, I focused my daily reading and research on the tribulation and how it's presented throughout the scriptures. As time passed, I began to put the events together in sequential order, but I ran into problems. What I was reading in the Bible was not what I was taught, what I was finding in commentaries, or what I was hearing from various pulpits. It took time for me to discover why my results differed from these sources. Research revealed that there are 4 reasons why my results differ from current instruction. My division of Matthew chapter 24, my method of interpreting the judgments of Revelation 6 through 16, my rejection of the parallel interpretation of Matthew 24 and Revelation 6, and my application of Revelation 16:13 and Daniel 12 verses 11 and 12. This first half, this introductory video, is going to cover the first 2 of these topics. Now, all of my research was based on a grammatical historical interpretation of scriptures, and thus it is premillennial and dispensational. Finally, there are 2 main reasons why the average Christian is confused about the book of Revelation. And first, there is the book itself. Revelation is unique in its content and presentation. Therefore, many people, they seek assistance. But this leads to the second problem. There are such a variety of interpretations being taught from books and pulpits and TV and on the radio that most people don't realize that they are receiving conflicting information. What is interesting is that except for a small handful of items, theologians and even those who are considered prophecy experts do not agree on the various events of the tribulation. Now, the first reason my results differ is my division of Matthew chapter 24 verses 1 through 31, the Sermon on the Mount. Now, Matthew 24 is one of the key passages to understanding the tribulation, and J. Dwight Pentecost lists 4 methods used by conservative commentators to divide Matthew 24 and apply it to the tribulation. Now, Dr. Pentecost earned his doctorate at Dallas Seminary in 1955 and then taught there for many years. His book, Things to Come, is a standard text in eschatology for Bible colleges and seminaries. This first view, and this view and the next 3 views are taken straight out of Dr. Pentecost's book. This first view is Louis Sperry Chafer's. And Louis Sperry Chafer was the founder of Dallas Seminary, and he wrote a systematic theology in the 1930s. Chafer believed that Matthew 24 verses 4 through 9 describe the events of the church age, and verses 9 through 28 discuss the tribulation. And this chart that you're looking at is a representation of Matthew chapter 24, and there will be several more, and I will leave them up so that you can compare them visually to help you understand. Okay? The second view, the second view is from C.I. Scofield. Now, C.I. Scofield is the author of the Scofield Reference Bible from the early 1900s, and this was the first Bible published with dispensational study notes. He believed that Matthew chapter 24 verses 4 through 14 had a dual fulfillment for both the church and the first half of the tribulation, and that verses 15 through 28 were the second half of the tribulation, and verses 29 through 31 was the return of Jesus. This third view is from a man by the name of Schuyler English, and his commentary was published in 1943 and is probably a known example of this particular interpretive position. Now, he wrote, in Matthew 24, verses 4 through 14, refer to the first half of that week, the tribulation, the beginning of the end. And verses 15 through 26 relate to the latter half of the tribulation, which he calls the Great Tribulation, and then the end shall come. Now, Dr. Pentecost includes his own view, and this is Dr. Pentecost's view here. The fourth view, he suggests that verses 4 through 8, down here in the orange, describe the first half of the 7 years, and verses 9 through 26 describe the second half, which he calls the Great Tribulation. Now, I've included this fifth view. Dr. Ron Bagalki, in his article on the Pre-Trib website, and there is a website called pretrib.org, which contains many great articles that you can read. But this is Dr. Bagalki's version of Matthew chapter 24, and he suggests that verses 4 through 20 actually discuss the first half of the tribulation. And in that particular article, he doesn't say what he does with the rest of Matthew chapter 24. The key takeaway from each of these charts is what I described in the introduction. There is agreement that Matthew 24 discusses the 7-year tribulation, but there isn't agreement regarding the division of Matthew chapter 24 and its application to the 7-year tribulation. Now, while looking at these charts, we should also note that there is some agreement as to the division of the text of Matthew 24. You will notice those divisions are in verse 4, where most begin. Now, that's because that's what Dr. Pentecost had in his book. But you'll see divisions at verse 4, verse 9, verse 4, verse 15, and verses 27 here, and verses 29 here, and 27 here and here. Now, a sixth view, my view, divides Matthew 24 based upon the text itself without any attempt to superimpose Revelation 6 on this. Now, I just introduced something without explaining it to you, but that's going to be later on, not only in this video, but also in the next one as well. And that is the superimposition of Revelation 6 on top of Matthew 24. The first division is Matthew 24 verses 1 and 2, which is prophecy in passing. Verses 3 through 6, which is the church age. Verses 7 and 8 are the only two verses that discuss the first half of the tribulation. That is the beginning of the birth pangs. Verses 9 through 14, the great persecution, which is most of the second half. Verses 15 through 28 is the great tribulation, and that's within the last 44 days. And again, I'm introducing something that will be revealed in the next video. There wasn't any way to avoid that. And Matthew 24 verses 29 through 31 is the return of Jesus, and that's within the last few days. Now, as you look at this chart, you should notice that Matthew 24 divides the tribulation, that is the specific tribulation, into 3 sections and not 2. You've got the church age, the beginning of the birth pangs, which is the first half. You've got the great persecution, which is most of the second half. And then you have the Great Tribulation, which is the last 44 days. This threefold division of the Great Tribulation will be discussed more in depth when we get to the section on Daniel 12, verses 11 and 12. Now let's break this down and look more closely at this division. Excuse me. Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24 begins with verses 1 and 2, prophecy in passing. And Jesus and the disciples are still in Jerusalem. And the passage starts this way. And Jesus came out from the temple and was going on his way when his disciples came up to point out the temple and the buildings to him. And he answered and said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone shall be left upon one another, which will not be torn down." Now I call this prophecy in passing. Now, it is very important to include these first two verses in our breakdown of Matthew 24 because Jesus' prophecy in verse 2 initiates the entire dialogue. It's why the apostles ask their three questions. And it is this event that Jesus refers to in verse 6 that is not yet the end. The dialogue begins while Jesus is still in Jerusalem. And for whatever reason, the apostles are discussing the temple and being marveled by it. And they feel the need to point it out to Jesus. Jesus' response is a brief prophecy of the temple's destruction. A destruction that will not take place for another 38 years, which would be well into the church age. Now, Daniel also prophesies of the temple destruction after the Messiah is cut off in Daniel 9:26. The second section of Matthew 24 is verses 3 through 6, and the conversation that began in Jerusalem is continued once they get to the mount. And as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" The big three questions that drive this entire dialogue. Jesus answered and said to them, "See to it that no one misleads you, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will mislead many. And you will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See to it that you are not frightened, for these things must take place, but that is not yet the end." This section begins with the apostles' three questions and ends with Jesus' very emphatic, "But that is not yet the end." The apostles' questions suggest that they may have thought that the destruction of the temple that Jesus just mentioned was a sign of the end and of his return. These words, "these things," in this context, are a reference to the destruction of the temple previously mentioned. Jesus does not directly answer the question, when will these things happen? In other words, when will the temple be destroyed? Instead, he points out that the destruction previously mentioned is not a sign of the end of the age, nor of his coming. These things are not yet the end. And it's important to understand that in the Greek language, in the original Greek text, the phrase, "but that is not yet the end," it is very strong and very emphatic, so there's no confusion. The two identifying characteristics of the church age are false Christs and wars. The things described in verses 4 through 6 are emphatically not the end, whereas the things described in the next verse, verse 7, are called the beginning. Verses 4 through 6 occur before the beginning, and that is why they are the church age. The third section of Matthew 24 is verses 7 and 8. These are the only two verses that talk about the first half of the tribulation in Matthew 24. They begin with the conjunction, it's the Greek conjunction gar, which means therefore, and ends with the chronological marker, merely the beginning. This is the first half of the 7 years. And it reads, "For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of the birth pangs." The three identifying characteristics of the first half of the 7 years are conflicts, earthquakes, which is in the plural, and famines, which is also in the plural. Now, in the book of Revelation, the sixth seal through the sixth trumpet only discuss divine judgments. There is no mention of human warfare, and I know that's a very popular instruction these days, but when we get to those points, you're going to see that idea is very much in error. 3 earthquakes are mentioned in Revelation 6 through 16. The sixth seal, which is global. The seventh seal with no identified location. And the sixth trumpet, which is felt at Jerusalem. The first trumpet burns the trees and destroys the grasses over 1/3 of the earth's surface, and by extension, this would include agriculture. Famine would follow. Now, this brings us to a very important contrast. The word wars is used twice in verse 6 with regards to the church age. This tells us that Jesus is not shy about using this word, but in describing the conflict during the first half of the 7 years, he uses circumlocution. He uses other words to describe it. He says, nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. By doing this, he may be suggesting that what we call today hot war isn't the only kind of conflict, that the spectrum may include political intrigue, economic sanctions, terrorism, Cold War, or even hot war. And it is equally possible that the construction of this sentence is implying that the nations and kingdoms are rising against each other at the same time. In other words, global conflict, a world war. Now this idea of circumlocution, saying something the long way, it's also used in the first, second, and fourth seal. There, the conflict is implied by carrying a bow or taking peace, or by killing with the sword. Now these distinctions should not be ignored or treated casually. The fourth section, verses 9 through 14. The fourth section begins with verse 9 with the word then, and ends with ends in verse 14 with the phrase, and then the end shall come. Now these verses describe all but the last 44 days of the second half. And I mentioned before, I'm having to introduce this in advance, so bear with me. Now the reason for this is going to be explained when we get to the section on Daniel 12, verses 11 and 12. Now, let's read this. Then they will deliver you to tribulation, and will kill you. And you will be hated by all nations on account of my name. And at that time many will fall away, and will deliver up one another, and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise, and will mislead many. And because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world for a witness to all nations, and then the end shall come. Now the identifying characteristics of the second half of the 7 years, the second half of the tribulation, are false prophets and martyrdom, but there is also hatred and betrayal. Verse 13 includes an encouragement that they endure to the end. Jesus has not departed from the initial question regarding the end. Here, he is saying that they are still not at the end, but that the end is coming. In the very next verse, verse 14, he introduces the first of two identifiable signs. That is the preaching of the gospel of the kingdom to the whole world. This is an answer to the disciples' second question, and is further described in Revelation 14, verses 6 and 7. Now, up to this point, Jesus has spoken in generalities. He's talked about conflicts, famines, earthquakes, persecution, etc. Here he gives a very specific sign. Matthew 24:14's reference to the end precedes 24:15's reference to the abomination of desolation. This means that the placement of the abomination of desolation is at the end. Now, by contrast, most commentators have 24:15 in the middle of the 7 years. In other words, they have the end in the middle and lasting 3.5 years. Section number 5, the Great Tribulation, verses 15 through 28. Verses 15 through 28 describes the end referred to in verse 14. This occurs during the last 44 days. The text starts with a therefore, and the end is described as having a great tribulation, worse than anything in history past or future. Let's read portions of it. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken through the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Then there will be great tribulation. Then, if anyone says to you, this is the breakdown of this particular portion of Matthew chapter 24. And the important thing is to remember that this entire section here is all giving extra information regarding what Jesus says, starting in verse 15. Now, verses 16 through 20 are Jesus' warning about the quickness with which the Great Tribulation will begin after the abomination of desolation is set up. It will start that day within hours. People do not have time to go from their roof to get into their house and grab a jacket and leave. And if they're out in the field, they don't have time to run home and then leave. When the abomination of desolation is set up, their job is to turn and run. Now verses 21 through 22 are Jesus' warning about how severe the Great Tribulation will be. There will be no equal in history past or future. And verses 23 through 28 are Jesus' warning about false messiahs during that time. Thus, it is a warning not to be deceived. Jesus' second coming will be a huge global event that no one will miss. No one will have an excuse. They don't have to go into a room or out in the desert or something to see a human. Because when Jesus comes, nobody will miss it. The characteristics for the last 44 days are great tribulation and deception by false Christs and false prophets. The second of two identifiable signs of the end is given, and which is the placement of the abomination of desolation. There are two specific signs to watch for. The final announcement of the gospel of the kingdom. And this is not the gospel of grace the church age has done. This is the gospel of the kingdom. And this is described in Matthew 24:14 and Revelation 14 verses 6 and 7. And the second is the placement of the abomination of desolation, which is described here in Matthew 24:15, but it's calculated, and here's the key why we're going to get to this later, it's calculated in Daniel 12 verses 11 and 12. The sixth and final section is verses 29 through 31. It is Jesus himself in this passage that separates his own return from the Great Tribulation. Jesus' reference to the Great Tribulation is to the seven vial judgments. When Jesus talks about the Great Tribulation, he's referring to the vial judgments. That is the Great Tribulation. The events in these verses occur after the Great Tribulation. Therefore, the celestial events described are not part of the seven vials. Let's read the passage here. But immediately after the tribulation, he's talking about the Great Tribulation, of those days, not months, years, etc., days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heaven will be shaken, and the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth shall mourn. In other words, his return is obvious to the entire world. You don't have to go looking for him. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet. And they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. In summary, Matthew 24, verses 1 through 31, naturally divides into 6 sections, 4 of which describe the 7 years. 7 and 8, 9 through 14, 15 through 28, and as a subsection, 29 through 31. Now, the second reason that my results differ is my method of interpreting the judgments of Revelation 6 through 16. There are at least 6 words used by theologians and commentators to describe the differing methods of interpreting the 21 judgments of Revelation 6 through 16. There is sequential, successive, recapitulation, contemporaneous, parallel, simultaneous. Huge words. Now these 6 words reduced to 2 methods. And for the sake of brevity, I'm going to stick with contemporaneous and successive. In the contemporaneous view, there are really only 7 judgments, but they're viewed from 3 different angles, or viewed 3 different times, or 3 different ways. Now, Dr. John McLean, in his article on the Pre-Trib website, The Chronological and Sequential Structure of Revelation, he writes the following. The simultaneous, this is the contemporaneous view, sees a recapitulation of the septets in which the judgments are parallel to each other. The recapitulation view understands that the 3 sets of judgments take place in the same order and at the time sequence with varying level of each depiction of the judgment. Big, huge theological words. He's simply saying there's 7 judgments viewed 3 different times with different levels of information being given. Now, of the commentators that I reviewed, only Leon Morris, in his Revelation commentary, preferred this method. And he writes, and this is a bit of a lengthy quote, but you'll understand. Because he concedes at the beginning of this to the idea of a sequential interpretation. Some have held that the groups denote separate and successive events. He concedes to the idea. Since it is not possible to recognize any one series in the descriptions of the others in this view, must remain possible. But it is perhaps more likely that there is a unity, that he, John the Apostle, does not take in the whole in any one vision or series of visions. He deals with different aspects, sometimes covering the same ground from different points of view, and sometimes taking in different features of the landscape. Thus, we may legitimately expect some things to recur in the visions, but always new details will make their appearance. Again, there's only 7 judgments, viewed 3 different ways or 3 different levels of understanding. The next one is going to be the successive view. And this view is held by Doctors Walvoord, Ryrie, and Reverend Larkin. Now, Walvoord and Ryrie were contemporaries at Dallas Seminary for decades, from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And both were pillars in the advancement of dispensationalism as we understand it today. Now, nevertheless, even though they likely ate at the same lunch tables, they disagreed on the timing of the judgments during the tribulation. Now, Clarence Larkin is a different individual. He was an early proponent of dispensationalism, and he wrote numerous commentaries between 1917 and 1929. If you've ever seen someone on TV posting huge posters of the sequence of events for the tribulation, that kind of started with him. And this is a fair representation of Walvoord's method. And it's based on what he wrote in his commentary. The 6 seals seem to unfold successively in a chronological pattern. Out of the 7th seal will come another series of 7 trumpets, and out of the 7th trumpet will come another series of 7 vials or bowls of the wrath of God. Actually, however, here it is. The 7 seals comprehend the whole as the trumpets and the vials comprehended in the 7th seal. The 7th sealed book, therefore, is the comprehensive program of God, culminating in the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, Walvoord appears, I'm going to go back just a sec. This is the 7 years up here. He has the first half of the tribulation uneventful and quiet. He pushes everything into the second half. And when we get to, in just a moment, we'll get to the quotations. He literally has the trumpets and the vials all the way at the very end. I'll be back. Let's go ahead. So I've got some more reading here. Now, it is likely, and this is really important, it is likely that the core interpretation made by Walvoord that leads to every other interpretation in his method and resulted in this is he claims that the rider of the first seal, the rider in white, is the first beast of Revelation 13. This is why he moves all of the judgments to the second half of the 7 years. Now he wrote, while the dispute as to the identity of the rider of the first seal, the one in white, cannot be finally settled, especially in the brief compass of this discussion, the conclusion identifying him as the world ruler of the tribulation, the same individual described as the beast out of the sea in Revelation 13, is preferred. His own quotation confirms what I just suggested. He recognizes the rider of the first seal is the first beast of Revelation 13. Now, all of his other interpretations flowed from this decision. Everything is in the second half of the tribulation. Now, as additional support for his decision, he also writes, the fact that the book of Revelation never speaks of a 7-year period. He discards Daniel 9:27. Only of a period of 3.5 years, 42 months, or a similar designation. Now finally, there is there is an assumption that he makes to support this particular interpretation. He assumes that a bad judgment must by definition be in the Great Tribulation. which for him is the entire second half of the 7 years. He states this. He states this in regard to the fourth seal on page 132, the sixth seal on page 133, and the placement of the two witnesses in page 178. Now let's look at Charles Ryrie. Charles Ryrie believes that the first 6 seals occur during the first half of this, while the 7th seal, all 7 trumpets, and the 7 vial judgments are the second half. And this is the entire 7 years in green. You've got the seals in orange, the trumpet in red here, and the vials in dark red. And you can see how he pushes everything, but with the same idea, the 7th seal incorporates everything that follows it. And this chart actually is a representation from page 70 of his own commentary written in 1996. Now, I found it interesting that Charles Ryrie seems to have altered his position between the publishing of his basic theology in 1986 and his Revelation commentary 10 years later in 96. In his basic theology, Ryrie places the seals in the first year, all the seals in the first year. And he writes, either way, however, the sealed judgments are the first judgments of the tribulation days and will probably occur during the first year of that period. And that's from page 466 of his basic theology. Excuse me. Now this is Clarence Larkin's. His commentary was written in 1919. And his is a third view regarding the timing of the judgments. Let's read from his commentary. We must not forget that the 7th seal includes all that happens during the sounding of the trumpets and the pouring out of the vials. You can see this here. That same idea. And so extends down to the ushering of the millennium, all the way down here. Now on the next page he says, as the same 4 things happen when the 7th trumpet sounds and the 7th vial is poured out, it is clear that the 7th seal, the 7th trumpet, and the 7th vial all end alike, and therefore, he assumes, and synchronize as to their ending, that is, all end at the same time at the end of the week. Now again, this chart approximates the chart from pages 48 and 49 of his commentary. He has all the seals and 6 of the trumpets in the first half, and appears to have the 7th trumpet at the midpoint of the 7 years. Then he has a gap in the judgments until the very end, where the vials are poured out. And you can see this gap right in here. Excuse me. Now the big observation to make from these charts is that the successive method is not completely successive. The 7th seal and the 7th trumpet are not their own events. That's very important. Now for this reason, this method, now I'm going to be referring to this as the overlapping method for obvious reasons, because they have them overlapping. And I'm going to do this to distinguish it from a truly sequential method. I've gone ahead and I've thrown all these together on the same page so that you can see what's happening here. You have Walvert at the top. He shoved everything into the second half. You have Ryrie, who's actually moved the seals into the first half and kept everything else back here. And then you have Larkin, who was actually the first commentator in 1919. He actually has the seals and the trumpets in the first half, and then he has a gap, and then the vials at the very end. But let's look at a truly sequential method, my method. The 21 judgments in the book of Revelation are presented sequentially. And there is nothing in the book of Revelation to suggest that they be interpreted in any other way or any other fashion. The truly sequential method is just that. Once the events described in Revelation 8 verses 1 through 5 have occurred, the 7th seal is fully complete. Nothing that follows is part of the 7th seal. In the same fashion, once the events described in Revelation 11 verses 15 through 19 have occurred, the 7th trumpet is fully complete, and nothing that comes after that is part of the 7th trumpet. And this is the distinction. Just because the 7 angels received the trumpets at the 7th seal doesn't demand or even suggest that the sounding of the trumpets are part of the 7 seals. They don't even prepare to sound until after the earthquake of the 7th seal. Now even more, there is nothing in the description of the seventh trumpet about the vials. Now the seventh trumpet is in Revelation 11, but the seven vials don't even occur until Revelation 15. This chart of the timing of the judgments is based upon a sequential method. Now all the way on the far left, the green section, the first 5 seals are opened within days, or even hours after the beginning of the 7 years. And when we get to the 5th seal, you'll understand that. This is really making some of you not happy. This will be fully explained when we actually discuss the 5th seal. The orange section, the 6th seal through the 6th trumpet, they occur during the first half. The 2 witnesses, one of whom is Elijah, have a ministry of reconciliation for Israel and judgment for the world. This occurs during the first half of the 7 years when Israel has a temple and a sacrifice. The world recognizes that the witnesses originate the judgments. Revelation 11 verse 6 and verse 10. The witnesses are killed near, if not exactly at, the middle of the 7 years. And the earthquake after their resurrection is the end of the 6th trumpet. Thus you'll see 1263 days. The red section, there are no judgments. During the majority of the second half, God's witnesses are gone. The devil and the Antichrist are tyrannizing a world that has already rejected God. In fact, you could actually look at this entire section here as God's loosening of the Antichrist and the devil on the planet as if his judgment. The dark red section on the right, the 7th trumpet and all 7 vials and the return of Jesus occur during the last 44 days. God is the one who initiates the 7th trumpet and commands the pouring out of the vial judgments. That's in Daniel 7, verses 13 and 14, Revelation 15, 5 through 16, 1. Now, except for the overlapping part, this chart is very similar to Larkin's chart. In a similar fashion, Ryrie in his basic theology places the vials very near the end, and he writes, "These last plagues will come in the closing months, or possibly even weeks, of the last year of the tribulation without interruption or pause." And even Dwight Pentecost, in his book Things to Come, he writes, "The vials seem to cover a very brief period of time at the end of the tribulation, just prior to the second advent of Christ." Now let's look at some evidence. The evidence supporting a truly sequential method. First, the judgments are presented sequentially. A sequential interpretation of the judgments is preferred first and foremost because that's how they're presented. And there is nothing in the text to suggest that they be interpreted in any other fashion. The sequential method is preferred because both the 7th seal and the 7th trumpet have specific events related to them that are completed before the first trumpet and the first vial, respectively. The events related to the 7th seal are as follows. Silence, 7 angels receive 7 trumpets, prayers and incense are offered to God, and altar fire is thrown to the earth. And this altar fire manifests itself as peals of thunder, sounds, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. The events related to the 7th trumpet are as follows. Jesus is given the kingdom of the world. Voices praise, elders worship and give thanks, the temple is open and the ark is seen. And again, there are flashes of lightning, sounds, peals of thunder, and an earthquake, and a great hailstorm. The third reason that the sequential method is preferred is because of Jesus' own words in Matthew 24:8. Jesus says, "But all these things are merely the beginning of the birth pangs." In other words, he's making it clear in his dialogue that there is a sequence of events that are happening. Jesus' general description of the beginning of birth pangs, famines, and earthquakes describes some of the events of the 6th seal through the 6th trumpet, but he is clear that this is just the beginning. With the very next verse in Matthew 24 verse 9, where he starts discussing the second half of the tribulation, he describes the persecution that begins in the middle of the 7 years. And this is also seen in Revelation 12:17, where a group of Israelites need protection for their 1,260 days while the devil wages war against all believers. Also, the death of the two witnesses let me reread that. Also, after the death of the two witnesses, there are no more earthquakes, plagues, or droughts until the seventh trumpet, near the very end of the 7 years. The overlapping method of interpretation is rejected because it introduces an unnecessary level of complexity, and it ignores the very events that describe the seventh seal and the seventh trumpet. Now this brings us to the conclusion of the first half of the introductory information, background information. Now, to review, this background and introduction has 4 portions. My division of Matthew 24, my method of interpreting the judgments of Revelation 6-16, and these other 2 will be covered in the next video. Now, my division of Matthew chapter 24 is based upon the text itself without trying to jam Revelation 6 back into it. It's a straightaway, purely exegetical interpretation of Matthew 24, allowing the chronological markers to tell the story. And my method of interpreting the judgments of Revelation 6-16 is a purely sequential method with no overlapping or any other form of convoluted interpretation methods, because that's the straight reading of the text. Now, thank you very much for tuning in, and have a good day.